Hello and welcome to CS 303. Today we will be discussing chapter number 3 and lecture number 2. So this is CS 303, chapter number 3, lecture number 2. Okay, now I am on slide number 2, which is titled Process Control Block. Okay. So in the last class we looked at the concept of a process. We also discussed how we can distinguish a process from a program. So program is a process in execution whose instructions are being executed, which is in main memory, right? And we also looked at different states that a process could be in: new, ready, running, waiting, terminated, and how it could change its state from one to the other during its life cycle, right? So now let us talk about this process control block. So we are aware that a process has many attributes, right? It has many values, and these need to be stored so that the OS can take appropriate action on the process. So for example, if a process is ready, then that's a signal to the OS scheduling algorithm that it can now pick up the process and assign the CPU to it, right? If a process, if its state is terminated, it's a signal to the OS that now it can kill the process, it can remove it from memory, and all the resources that the process was using can now be reclaimed back by the operating system, so that it can assign those resources to some other process or program, right? So therefore we need to we need a place to store all of these attributes for a process, for each and every process. So it turns out there's a data structure, a special data structure used for that, and that data structure is called a process control block, or a PCB, right? Process control block or PCB. What kind of contents will this PCB have? So definitely a process state will be one. So whether state is whether the process is running, whether it's ready, whether it's waiting, right? So one component which will be stored in the PCB is process state. The other thing, program counter. So we all know about the program counter. What kind of value does a program counter contain? So we know that it contains the memory address of the next instruction that has to be executed. So you can either go sequential, or you can go in parallel, or you can jump from one to the other, or you can do repeated execution in terms of recursion or while you're in a loop. So at all times for a process, you need to know from which memory address should we fetch the next instruction from. So we saw that in that hardware example that we looked at in chapter number 1, right? So program counter value has to be stored. CPU registers, third thing. So information on registers must be saved when an interrupt occurs to allow the process to resume its execution later. So let's say the process is doing some calculation, and some intermediate values are stored in a register, right? And then there's an interrupt, and the process must be preempted, which means the CPU must be taken away from the process and given to some other process. So we have this preemption, and therefore we need to safely store those register contents. So those will be stored in the process control block. And then later on, when a process's turn comes again to execute, we just reload those CPU values from its PCB, right? Next is CPU scheduling information, right? So here you can have information about the priority of a process. So we'll soon see. Each process can be assigned a priority value. So which means that if a priority value of a process is higher, it gets an earlier shot at the CPU. Right? If it's lower, it will get a turn to execute a bit later. So if you want, you can assign priorities. It is not mandatory. Pointers to scheduling queues. So you may be running different kinds of scheduling algorithms, and for each algorithm there might be a different queue of processes. So for scheduling algorithm 1 I have Q1, for scheduling algorithm 2 I have Q2, and so on and so forth. So therefore we definitely need pointers to all those queues. So those are stored in the PCB. And then we also have scheduling parameters, right? So which, let's say if you are using round robin scheduling, what is the quantum, right? So again we'll discuss more about that in chapter 5. But CPU scheduling information can also be stored in the PCB. Okay, now I am on slide number 3. So we are still discussing the process control block, the PCB. Some other information on memory management, right? So value of base and limit registers. So these are used to these the values in these registers. They are used to determine whether a memory access is valid or it is illegal. So each process is assigned some address space, right? And so it will have memory locations at the lower and the higher level. So for each memory address that is generated by the CPU, we have to check whether it is within the bounds, right? If it's within the bounds, it means it's okay. We can go ahead and fetch from that memory location. If it is not within bounds, it means we're trying to access a memory maybe allotted to some other process or maybe unallotted, right? So therefore, we have base and limit registers. In the chapter on memory management, we'll look at them in more detail. Information about page table. So we divide memory into certain chunks, certain parts called pages, and page table is a data structure which shows our address mapping. So information on page table also is stored in the PCB. Accounting information: how much CPU time a process has used, what is the limit on its timer, what is the process ID. IO status information: list of IO devices allocated. So if a process is grabbing data from the disk is an IO device. So then the data structures and various values related to that disk will be stored in the PCB, right? Open files. So if it has any files open for reading and writing, then generally information such as a file descriptor will be stored, right? So in short, a PCB is a data structure used for storing information of each and every process. Okay. So when a running process becomes idle, stops executing, its state needs to be saved to its PCB, and when that process its state changes from idle to running back, then its state is reloaded from its PCB. Okay. Now I am on slide 4, and we can see this just shows in the form of a picture what kind of information a PCB contains. State of the process, process number, process ID. So if you execute that top or htop command on a Linux terminal, for each process a PID or a process ID will be given. So that value, program counter, register values, memory limits, list of open files. So like that, different kinds of information about a process are stored in its process control block or in its PCB. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide 5. So now we know about a process control block and how it is used to represent a process, to store information about a process, right? So in Linux, this PCB is represented as a C structure called task_struct. So task is just another name for a process. Linux calls processes tasks. So task_struct. So what are some of the real values in the PCB? So PID is 1, and you can note it's not an integer, which means they have defined their own data type for it. state of the process, which is a long variable, data type long, scheduling information, so time slice. So what happens in round robin scheduling algorithm is each process gets the CPU for a fixed amount of time, after which it is taken away. The CPU is taken away from a process and given to another one. So you sort of go in a round robin way. So what is the value for that time slice? Process is parent. So soon we'll see that each process can have a parent and child process. So we can have a for each for the whole set of processes we can have like a tree data structure. So process has a parent, so pointer to that parent, right? And then the data type for that is task underscore struct, right? Of course, process is children, right? List of open files, right? File struct pointed to the list of open files, right? So maybe you have an array of pointers, right? And each member in that array is a pointer and it points to one open file. So a pointer to that array of pointers, right? Address space of this process, a pointer to that, right? So as you can see below in this slide, you have a bunch of PCBs which are connected together and each corresponding to a process. So for example, this could be a process Q, and then one of the processes is marked as currently running. So for whom the state is running. So in case if you are interested, you are encouraged to check out the complete contents of this Linux process control block. So the website is given github.com/torvalds linux blob master include linux schedule.h. So this shows the complete definition of task underscore struct. Okay, so it's a fairly large file, and if I see it has got about 2000, so it's got 2051 lines of code. Well, there are some blanks in between, but you get the idea. It's a large file. So this is the complete implementation of task underscore struct. So in this slide we just showed a couple of the data elements, right? So this itself is calling a lot of structures, one for scheduling parameters, one for files, one for memory policy. It's calling a bunch of structures on its own. So we know from C programming we are allowed to have structures within a structure, perfectly legal, right? And you can just scroll down and see how it is defining the various states, right? So running is one, interruptible is another, uninterruptible, dead, zombie, and so on. Different states of a process. Okay. And you can scroll down and you can see some other information. So all of it may not make sense, but at least some of it you should be able to make out. And this will show you the complete implementation of task struct. So the main thing here is this is a data structure which in Linux contains all the information relevant to a process. Okay, now I am on slide 6 where we are talking about context switch. Okay. So what exactly is this context switch? So first line here states that this is needed to support multi-programming. So now one thing we look at is in chapter 1 we discuss the concept of multi-programming. So what exactly is this multi-programming? So if you recall, what we discussed was that if you look at the execution trace of many common processes, so they alternate between CPU activity and IO activity. So in CPU activity, their instructions are being executed by the CPU. This generally happens very fast, and in IO activity they are waiting for some IO, right, for some input output. And generally the IO times are much larger than CPU times. Okay. So if a process is waiting for user input may come in 1 second or it may come in 2 minutes, we don't know, right? So because of that, because they alternate between CPU and IO activities, so when a process is in an IO cycle, then it makes sense to give the CPU to some other process. So the 2-3 seconds or 2-3 minutes it takes to do IO of process 1, and that same time we can we can go ahead and give the CPU to some other process. Okay. So soon we'll look at some numerical examples for this. So the idea is to improve the utilization of the CPU. So otherwise the process will wait for IO and the CPU will be idle. So like that we can support many processes, and all those processes have to be brought into memory. So now what happens when a task enters or a process enters into its IO mode? So then we have to give the CPU to some other process, so that that other process will start to execute now. So this is called a context switch. When the CPU switches to another process from the currently executing process, we have what we call a context switch. So we are switching from one process to the other, and the system must do two things. It must save the state of the old process, because note that the old process has not terminated yet. It's in the middle of executing. It just reached an IO state. So system must save the state of the old process. Where will it be saved? It will be saved into that process's PCB, process control block. So save the state of the old process and load the saved state for the new process via a context switch. So you have a save and a load, right? Saving of the process you want to interrupt, load of the process you want to execute. Okay. So context of a process is represented in its PCB, definitely. So the process that you want to bring in, maybe it was executing some time back. So now where which instruction does it start from now? Well, that is contained in its program counter. What is the scheduling algorithm on it? Again contained in the PCB. So you need the PCB for the context. So context switch time is overhead. The system does no useful work while switching. So while saving the state and reloading the state, this is overhead. CPU is idle. Okay. So how much is the context switch time? It depends. It depends on hardware support, speed of the memory, because you have to copy things like registers. So fast memory copying means context switch time will be low. Typical context switch time within microseconds. Okay, so it's not too bad as long as you don't have too many of these. Some hardware provides multiple sets of registers per CPU, and so with multiple sets of registers you can load multiple contexts at the same time in parallel. So that can help things a bit. So because note that while you're saving the context of process A, right, and then loading the context of process B, you're not really executing any process instructions, right? You just have memory accesses. So that time is overhead. That will not count as among your useful work done. So therefore number of context switches has to be kept to a low number. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide 7, and this shows us in the form of a picture how a context switch is happening from process P0 to process P1. So you can see two processes running. So initially what's going on is process P0 is running, which means that the CPU is executing P0's instruction. So here the assumption is we have only a single CPU. So because if we had two CPUs, then processes P0 and P1 could run at the same time. But here we have only one CPU, so which means how many processes can run at a particular point of time? One and only one. So initially process P0 is executing, and then what happens is we have a system call or interrupt, right? And what we need to do is we need to perform a context switch, which means now P1 has to start executing. So perhaps process P1 has a higher priority, and once it arrives, and then we say that we want to give the CPU to it. Or it could be that P0 is executing and its time quantum has expired. So now it has to give the CPU to P1 for the sake of fairness. So whatever be the reason, now we start saving the state of P0 in its PCB. So save state into PCB 0, right? So which instruction it was on, right? Is that instruction finished or not? Or are we stopping in between, right? What are the contents of registers? So basically all these kind of things are saved. They are part of the state of P0 and they are saved in PCB 0. And now before we execute P1, so if P1 was already running, then we reload state for P1. So you can see for some period of time both processes are idle, none of them is executing. So that is the context switch overhead. And then what happens is once we reload the state from PCB1, now that means we can start executing P1. So P1 runs for a while, and then what happens is again it's time for P0 to run. So save state this time of P1 in PCB1, and then reload state from PCB0, start executing P0. So you can see we have two context switches, and you can see the overhead, and during this context switch overhead neither process is running. Okay. But we may have to do context switches due to some reason or the other, right? Maybe we have a fairness algorithm in which a process cannot run beyond a particular point of time, it has to give the CPU to some other process, or the new process is its priority is very high. So due to a number of reasons we may need to do context switches. Okay, so I hope this process of context switch is clear. Okay, so now I am on slide 8. So this just describes in words what we were looking at in slide number 7. So process A or 0 is running on CPU. We want to interrupt its execution and give CPU to process B or process 1. Need to save state information for process A. PC values, contents of registers, state information stored in A's PCB, CPU given to B. If B was interrupted earlier, its state is loaded from its PCB. When A gets its turn to run, its state is loaded from its PCB. So in short, a PCB serves as a storage place for process specific information. Okay. So this is just describing what we discussed in the previous slide, how exactly a context switch is happening. So I hope now process or the concept of a context switch is clear. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide number 9. And now we talk about process operations. So now we have a good idea, we have a good grip on what a process is, right? Process versus program, process control block, process context switch, right? So essentially, all this information now should be clear to us. Okay. So whether you call it a process or a job or a task or an application, they pretty much mean the same thing. So they are all units of work for the operating system. They all consist of code, right, instructions and data, right. So whether you have a video game or an Adobe Acrobat software or a web browser or a Facebook app, it consists of code plus data, right. So eventually that process has to run, CPU has to execute the instructions using the data. Okay. So now that we know processes, we have a good idea about processes. Now we discuss the various operations that we can perform on processes. So with regards to process, management, there are many things that an operating system does, many things that an operating system is supposed to do, many operations on processes that the operating system is supposed to perform. So we will be looking at some of them, because process management is one of the key goals of an operating system. Okay. So operations on processes, right? So processes in modern OSs can execute concurrently. So we have many CPUs available, and so at any one point of time we can have many processes running concurrently. They can also be created and deleted dynamically at runtime, right? Compare this to processes that start automatically, right? So whenever you turn on an OS, there are many many kernel processes that automatically start, right? Which are also maybe running in the background, right? So now we study mechanism for process creation and termination. Okay. So two major operations for which we will discuss system calls are: one operation is for process creation, right, for creating a process. Another operation is for process termination, ending a process. So very key process operations. We will look at system calls for both. How is a process identified uniquely? We can do that using its process ID or using its PID. So within Linux, if you type in table of processes or top, for each process you will see a PID. So I am looking at 2697, 2986, 1, 2, 10, 11, so on. So generally your system processes will have a smaller PID number, and the user processes which we create as users will have larger numbers. So each process is identified using its process ID or PID, which is essentially an integer. Okay. A process may, during the course of its execution, create multiple new processes. Create a process is called parent. Process created are called child. So for example, if you are running a terminal, right, and then from that terminal you open up a web browser, or you open up an Emacs editor for programming, or you open up some other program. From within that from within that terminal, then your terminal is your parent process, and whichever process you open, that becomes your child process. So like that you can have many parent and child processes. These child processes may in turn further create more processes, which leads us to a process tree. Okay. So using Linux you can easily create a process tree. So on the on the Linux terminal you can type PS, right? This will give you a list of all running processes, PS, right? So type PS, it gives you all running processes. So you can do a man PS, man space PS on a Linux terminal to find out more about this command. So it gives you a list of all processes, PS. If you want this information in a tree format, you can type in PS tree. PS tree. So it gives you all processes, parent and child, in the form of a tree. Okay. So again, this is something you should check out: PS and PS tree. So we'll also do a session on this. So using these tools, you can, within your own system, you can look at the process tree. Okay. Okay. So this shows the process tree from a Sun Solaris system. So in the previous slide, we learned how we can create our own process tree using a PS and PS tree command. So do a simple Google search, and you will find out about both of these programs, PS and PS tree. Okay, and then just use them to look at your process information. PS stands for process status. Okay, and PS tree will give you the processes in tree format. Okay. So this is what a process tree looks like in Sun Solaris Unix variant. So you can see schedule, process, init, page out, FS flush. Some of these you can recognize. Netscape, if you see, Netscape is a web browser. It is no longer around, but used to be popular. I think in the 90s, maybe even the 2000s. Netscape web browser. Emacs is a text editor. This is still around. A very good text editor for programming. ls we know for listing the contents of current directory. Cat for concatenation, right? There's a login process there. A telnet communication daemon. CSH a shell process. So again you have page out looks like a memory process. So you have various kinds of processes. Each process has a process ID, and they are they have some kind of tree formation. Okay. So what happens is probably one of the users has a shell, CSH, a shell or a command line, and then within that command line they opened Netscape browser and they opened Emacs editor. Another user typed ls from their shell and then cat from their shell. So like that you can have a parent-child relationship, and you can have the whole tree for a process. Okay. Okay. Now I am on slide number 11, and this just describes the processes given in the tree on the last slide. Okay. So root is schedule process with PID 0. Init root process for all user processes, right? Page out memory management, FS flush file system. So again we don't need to bother too much about what these processes are. Some of them we recognize, some of them we don't. Process for networking like telnet FTP, inet, INETD, CSH is a shell, we know that. Netscape web browser, Emacs text editor. Cat for combining and looking up files, right? So this just describes the processes we saw on the previous slide. Okay. Now let me just right. So given a process, it's fairly easy to find the parent process. There's a system call for that which we'll be using. So now I think hopefully now that you will understand the concept of a process tree. Depending on how processes are created dynamically, we can have a tree formation and parent processes and child processes, right? And then which are sort of connected together. So more details about this parent and child relationship among processes we will see very soon in this chapter. So what kind of information they share, what kind of operations can they perform on each other, right? So those kind of things we'll be looking at later in this chapter. Okay, but the generation of the process tree and concept of parent and child it should be clear. So here your shell process CSH, from within that shell process your Netscape process is being created, right? From within the shell your Emacs process is being created. So the shell is a parent, Netscape and Emacs are child processes. Okay. So I think hopefully that relationship that part should be clear. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide 12, and now we talk about process creation. So which system call do we use? How exactly does this work? We will be talking about it. So we know that process creation is a very important OS goal, right? So whenever you click on a process, your intention is you want the process to execute. So whether you're clicking on it using the GUI or you're typing the name of the process in the command line interpreter like CS or top or something. So the intention is that you create a process and then you execute its code, right? So how, as a system programmer, how can you create a process? Okay, that is what we are going to learn. We are going to learn how we can write a C program in which we can create processes, okay, using system calls. So processes need certain resources during their execution. What are those resources? CPU time, memory, files, and so on. Now question is, when you have this parent and child process, what kind of model do you want to go for when you share these resources? For example, if a parent has a file open, does the child get automatic access to it? Yes or no? Right. So you can have different models, different policies. Okay. So one model is parent and child share all resources allocated to a parent. Right. So whether it's the parent will get allotted a chunk of memory, and according to this model, all the child nodes, they have to live in only that chunk of memory. They won't be assigned any other address space, right? Likewise, CPU also they have to share among the parent, right? So parent and child share all resources which are allotted to the parent. That's one model. Another model is children share subset of parents' resources. So maybe they get their own CPU cycles, the child nodes, but they share the memory space, right? So in this model, children share a subset of parents' resources. Maybe they don't share CPU, maybe they don't share memory. We're talking about the child processes, but maybe they share only the open files, right? And third is parent and child share no resources, which means if a child needs a resource, it has to explicitly get that resource assigned by whom? By the OS. So different models of resource sharing are possible, right? Different execution models are also possible. So if you have a parent process and the parent process gives birth to a child process, right? Now both are active. So what kind of execution model do we go for? Do both the parent and child execute concurrently, right, at the same time, or does a parent wait until the child terminates, right? So if you have a terminal running and if you open an Emacs process on that, now when you want to get out of the terminal, do you wait for the Emacs to complete or not? Right. So essentially, even in terms of execution, you can have different models. One model is both the parent and child run concurrently, right? Perhaps on different CPUs. Another model is, once the child is created, the parent waits for the child to finish execution, and then it resumes execution. So both cases are possible in your program. You can have any one of these cases depending on your needs, right? For example, a process that needs to display an image may get the image path and output medium from its parent process, right? Till it gets those, it cannot do anything. So now what we'll do is we'll look at the system calls for creating a new process. So whichever is a currently executing process in that environment, if you want to create a new process, one or more, a new processes, the system call for that is a fork. Now as we discussed, we won't go into the low level of the system call. We will just be handling the API, the function. So we need to know about this fork function. Does it have any arguments? How do we call it? And what is this function going to return, both in case of successful execution and also in the case of unsuccessful execution. So let us now learn about the fork system call. Okay, so now I am on slide 13. So this is our fourth system call. So if you want to find out more about it, you can either Google it. So in a Google search bar, just type man fork, right, and it will take you to the manual pages. Or within a Linux or Mac terminal, right, just type in man space fork. So it will bring up the Linux programmer's manual with fork. So it will say the name is fork and it's used to create a child process. Okay. So using the system call, you can create a new process in Linux. So this is a fork function. It takes in no arguments, right? So no arguments are provided, and what it returns is it returns a process ID. Okay. So if it executes correctly, it will result in the creation of a new process, and the system will allocate a process ID to it. So remember, each process is identified. It has a unique identifier, which is its process ID. So this process ID is what is returned by fork. So if within your parent process you are calling fork, then fork will return back the process ID of the newly created process. So that way now you know its identity and you can use it accordingly in the program. Okay. Now by default, the new process will contain a copy of the memory address space of the original process. This includes the original process code. Okay. So for example, if I have a C program in which I have a main function, right? I call that file 1.c. Now within that 1.c, if I call a fork, then by default it will create another process, a child process, which will contain copy of 1.c. So whatever code I have in 1.c, it will contain a copy of that by default, right? So likewise, if I am creating a process from a command line terminal using fork, then by default the new process creates a copy of the command line terminal, okay, original process code. So that may not make sense. Why would we want to create a clone of that? So if we don't want that, in other words, if we want a new or different process to run in that newly created process, then we can use the exec system call. Okay, so we use the exec system call. You can find out more about it, exec. And what this will do is this will load a binary executable file of a suitable program and start its execution. So which program is that? You can provide the name of that program. It has to be an executable file, and you also need to provide the suitable path for that program. Okay. So once you do that, now your child process can run different code. Okay. So you call fork and it will create a child process within the parent process, which by default has a clone of the parent. It has the same code, exactly the same. And now if you want to load a new process into it, you can use the exec system call. Okay. So man and exec system calls. So now I am on slide 14. Now we look at a sample program. Okay. So in the live sessions, we'll also look at live code demonstrations or executions. Okay. So here what is happening? A C program forking a separate process. Okay. So this is our main. So generally this will be in a file. So this is not the whole program. We'll be providing you the whole program, but main intention here is to understand how fork and exec work. Okay. So we have our main. So let's say we have a process called 1.c. Within that we have a main program. So our execution will start here. So note that we need header files which are not included here. So PID underscore T and PID. So this is for storing the PID of a process. So PID underscore T is a specific type def data, the data type. If you want, you can also use int. Okay. Although PID underscore T is more reliable. And now what I do is PID is equal to fork. So what this will do is this will create a copy of the parent process. What is the parent process? Parent process is this C program 1.c. It will create it and then it will return a PID value. So now the question is, how do we distinguish between the parent and the child? Okay. Now the way that is done is this fork system call will return different values to the parent and the child, because note that from PID equal to fork onwards, now you have two processes running. One is a parent, one is a child, and by default they are running the same piece of code, which means they are running whatever comes after fork, both of them same code. So now note that fork will return different values to the parent and child processes. Okay, different values. Okay, so what is the difference here? What is it returning? So just give me a second. Yeah, so here as it says in the book, the return code for fork is 0 for the child process. So to the child process, the fork returns 0, whereas it is return code is non-zero for the parent process. So what it is saying is fork will return 0 to the child and non-zero to the parent. So to the parent it will generally return the process ID of the child. So we will see in that program which we discuss. Okay. So generally we have three ways we can go. What we need to do is we need to examine the value returned by the fork. So that's why we are saying PID equal to fork. So if PID is equal to 0, it means now we are in the child process. Okay. Because fork returns 0 to child. Okay. Fork returns 0 to child. If fork is not successful, it will return some negative value, because the negative value can never be a PID guaranteed. So if there is an error, if fork could not finish execution successfully, it will return a negative value. Now if fork returns a value greater than 0, it means the value being returned is the PID of the child process, and that it will return to the parent. So now what you are seeing over here is PID is equal to fork, and from this point onwards both parent and child are running, okay, with the same piece of code, because note that child gets a copy of the parent. So now if PID is equal to 0, provided the fork is successful, this will be ignored. Now assuming the fork failed, maybe there was not enough memory to create a new process. In that case fork fails, fork returns a negative value, and we just print back to the user fork failed. And now our first if is successful, so we get out of the main in case fork fails, right? So this is an if else, so only as soon as one of them is true we get out of the whole thing, and so in this case if the fork fails we get out of the program. Now else if PID is equal to 0. Okay. So note that from PID is equal to fork onwards, both processes parent and child are running, executing the same code, right? They are running concurrently. So maybe parent is running on one CPU, child is running on another CPU. So they are running concurrently, and PID will return different values to the parent and child. To the child it will return 0. So within the child process value of PID will be 0, and within the parent process value of PID will be greater than 0. Specifically it will be PID of the child. So now you can see that PID is equal to 0, child will take a hit there, and then it will do exec, which means it will execute a new process, not a copy of the parent. It will execute ls, right, and then get out. Parent process will make a hit at the last else. If PID is less than 0, it will not, because fork was successful. PID equal to 0, it will again not hit, because to the parent a value greater than 0 has been returned. So to the parent L, it will make a hit at the else, and what it will do is it will wait. So it will wait for the child to complete. Once the child completes, control is transferred to the parent, and parent prints child complete, and then it also finishes execution. So in this way, we have a program using fork and exec and also wait. Right. So what happens is, parent processes this C program called 1.c, right? And once we call fork, now we have both the parent and child running, and child has a copy of the parent by default, so both are running exact same piece of code from if PID is less than 0 to the last bracket, right? And we know that fork will return different values to the parent and the child, and depending on that, for the child we execute the exec command to make it run ls, and for the parent we just wait for the child and then we print child complete. So I hope this program is clear. We will also illustrate it in the live session. So last slide for today, I am on slide 15, example program. So this is just describing that previous program. So original process forks a child, which again I am repeating contains a copy of the parent, original C program. From that point onwards, from PID equal to fork onwards, both processes, parent and child, continue execution, right, from the instruction right after the fork. Right. Important question: how do we distinguish between the two processes? Answer lies in the return value of fork. As we said, 3 cases. If fork returns a negative value, fork was unsuccessful, we abort the program. Right. If fork returns 0, it is going to return 0 to the child. So note that after fork, 2 processes are running, both executing the same piece of code, but fork will return different values to parent and child. So they both have their own copies of PID, right? Parent has its copy of PID, child has its own copy of PID, and both PIDs will contain different values. For the child, PID will contain value 0. For the parent, PID will contain value greater than 0. Specifically, it will contain the PID of the child. So that way we can distinguish between the two, and we can use that if else to have them, both the parent and child, execute different things. So fork returns 0 to newly created child, fork returns positive value to original parent process. So please note the difference between PID value returned by fork, right, and actual PIDs assigned to parent and child. Okay. So the system will assign PIDs to the parent and child, right, automatically, and those may not be same as the values returned by fork, right. So the returned PID values are just to distinguish between the parent and child. So probably this last step we can skip for now. So the last point that we have, let us skip that for now. We'll come back to it later. Okay. So in this way we can have a simple program illustrating the usage of fork and exec, and also in fact of wait, right. So in the so what we'll do is we'll send you some simple fork programs, and also in the appropriate live session we will execute them live, and then we'll sort of see what kind of output we get, just so that we get a clear understanding of how these programs execute. Okay.